Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, some new updates on Trump and his ongoing semi battle with the GOP. It's actually getting a bit more interesting. Trump is saying no more rhinos, and he's encouraging people to donate to his PAC, even more so over the different ones tied to the GOP. Meaning, again, Trump is subverting right now the Republican Party and being pretty successful with it. We'll be talking about this tonight. Some of the pushback from the RNC, the Republican National Committee, and what's happening with that. I'm also going to be going to a few other stories talking about, for example, government lawsuits, Biden being sued by 12 different states. Going to be going into Ashley Babbitt's family members filing a lawsuit around what happened at the Capitol building, where Ashley Babbitt was, of course, shot and killed. Which could be very interesting because through the course of that lawsuit, some new information very likely could come to the surface, especially around security at the Capitol building, which Pelosi would be partly involved with. So, interesting stories tonight. We'll go into these, a few others. Folks, as always, questions, comments, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. Good seeing you all. Sam Ernest, it says, "Hi, Josh. How you been doing lately?" Doing all right. You know, New York's a bit wild. The world is a bit wild, I guess, but doing well. Hey, Zacharias, thank you. I appreciate the kind feedback. Gwyneth Cook, "Hi, Josh. Tennessee here. Good to see you. Thanks for being here." This is from Debbie Mezzi. "Hi, Josh. Northern New York here." F. Cuomo. Yeah. And we'll have to see what happens with Cuomo as well. There's a semi-battle taking place within Democrat factions right now to get him out of office. And it's really echoing what's happening in California as well with the Recall Gavin Newsom campaign. You can actually watch the interview we published tonight on one of the guys leading that movement in California. There's some interesting stuff happening right now that could really remake the way the country is, and also some stuff happening right now that could really change the world, I think, in good ways or bad ways. China, of course, being the biggest, and what they're doing, trying to promote their China model as the system to bounce back from the virus. Some updates around this, hopefully, as well. We'll see if we get to them. All right, folks, let's jump into the first story for the night. Now, first off, this is Epoch Time. Daily Caller, actually, here. It says, "No more money for rhinos," and rhino being Republican in name only. It says Trump releases statement calling for donations to be directed to his PAC after dispute with RNC. It says former President Donald Trump released a statement Monday night that said Republicans in name only, or rhinos, should no longer receive funding, and called on donors to send money to his super PAC instead. And Trump wrote in a statement, quote, "No more money for rhinos. They do nothing but hurt the Republican Party and our great voting base. They will never lead us to greatness. Send your donations to Save America PAC at donaldjtrump.com. We will bring it all back stronger than ever before." And of course, this goes back to what he announced this goes back to what he discussed at CPAC. And again, what I was saying is the biggest thing he announced at CPAC, which is his website, donaldjtrump.com, which is the Save America PAC, which he's using to basically replace and change the Republican Party from within. As Trump moves forward with this, very likely you're going to see a lot of Republicans get voted out. A lot of people may not run again. A lot of people are going to get a lot of pushback from their own base, and Republicans who break from the values that Trump was supporting when he was president are very likely going to face a lot of pressure both from Trump and from their voters. And so watch as this goes forward. You're going to see a real cultural shift take place within the Republican Party. Trump is going to be, rather than start his own party, he's subverting the Republican Party. He's transforming it from within. And interesting update on this. Have a look at this. This is how the Republican National Committee responded. And keep in mind, just real quick too, I'll just go over this. Trump's legal counsel sent a cease and desist letter Saturday to the Republican National Committee, which is the RNC, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and the National Republican Congressional Committee, telling them to stop using his name for fundraising. We discussed that in the last episode. Now, after Trump sent those essentially cease and desists to these different GOP financiers, these PACs that basically make up the meat of the GOP, and Trump being the new one kind of coming from left field to replace him. This is how the RNC responded. This is Epoch Times here. It says, RNC tells Trump it has every right to use his name, image in fundraising appeals. And it says here, the Republican National Committee is insisting it has the right to use former President Donald Trump's name and likeness in fundraising appeals after Trump sent cease and desist letters to the committee. In a March 8 letter obtained by the Epoch Times, the RNC's chief counsel, Justin Ramier, told Trump's Save America Political Action Committee, a PAC, that the RNC, quote, has every right to refer to public figures as it engages in core First Amendment protected political speech, and it will continue to do so in pursuit of these common goals. Now, let's step back and look at this picture. Do you think it works in the RNC's favor to, instead of trying to work with Trump, to instead say that we have the right to use your likeness and your name to advertise, to get donations, when Trump sent them a cease and desist telling them to stop doing it? Do you think it works for them to create this conflict between them and Trump when, again, they're using Trump's image and likeness as the way to get donations? In other words, the very narrative, image, and likeness they need to maintain their donor base, right, because they're a PAC, is something that they are breaking from by the very act of doing this. What do you think is going to happen to the RNC if they keep along this trajectory, right? Yeah. As Dave Johnson notes, no, Josh, they want to be buried. They really want to be buried, and I think you're right. Really, I think what's going to happen as this goes forward, you're going to watch really the foundations that work on the fundraising for the RNC. These organizations, of course, how do PACs get their money? They get donations from big corporations, big businesses, big donors, financiers, and so on. And part of that donation process, which was actually why Trump previously said he did not really solicit big corporations and so on. Part of that donation process is you owe them. You owe them debts. You have to pay it back, right? It's not just a matter of receiving a donation, getting behind a political candidate, putting people behind them to support their rise to whatever position they're going into, and then suddenly there's some independent individual, representing the people. Typically that is not how government works. No matter who it is, and I know people talk about AOC and so on, that she has people behind her writing her stuff. Most politicians are like that, especially when you get to the Senate level. And so you're almost always going to have some degree of special interest. By eliminating these organizations through competition, which Trump is doing, eliminating them through open competition, making himself the main source of donations, and again, he being really the face of the party and the main person who is motivating most people to go and vote, Trump is going to transform the whole party. Not only transform the Republican Party, but change really the culture of one of the political parties in the US, the Republican Party. You're going to see a Republican Party, if Trump is doing what he says he's going to do, and honestly, I think he may, a Republican Party with representatives elected who don't represent special interest if they come up through his PAC. Although you could say technically the special interest in this case would be supporting Trump's agenda, this Make America Great Again agenda, which he is promoting, again, Make America Great Again, saying when he was, leaving office and just some of his public statements, that this campaign is just beginning. This movement is just beginning. This Make America Great Again movement, it's just beginning. And you're going to see different officials coming up, rising up, backed by Trump's PAC, competing with the PAC, with the individuals backed by the other PACs, right? And even some of the folks currently in power who Trump deems are not representative of the American people, what he calls Republicans in name only, as we just mentioned. You're going to see this clash. And through this clash, you're going to see really a new party emerge under this skin, right? The veneer of the Republican Party. And remember going back a little bit, right? Remember going back a little bit that you had, again, you had rumors going around that Trump was going to be starting his own party. There were rumors of the Patriot Party, which did become a party. The rumors of other ones, Trump disavowed the Patriot Party, so on, right? Now, had Trump started his own party, which he's kind of doing right now through these actions, Had Trump started his own party, he would have had to have faced the real complicated dealings with, for example, registration, government policy on that. For example, dealing with the IRS and dealing with the possibility that Biden, now being president, might, just like under Obama, what happened when Biden was vice president, use the IRS to basically, weaponize the IRS to destroy that whole political movement. Remember, that's what happened to the Tea Party. And so Trump would have been facing that whole issue. You would have also had a split along partisan lines, where the Republican Party would basically be two parties, and you'd have a split vote that would have to compete with both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, which means the Democrats would probably still win. Trump took another approach entirely, which is subvert the existing party, replace it from within, transform it from within. You are going to see, again, what he's doing right now. What he's doing right now is he's creating his own party, but he's doing it inside of the Republican Party. You see? I mean, the strategic level of this is something to be admired, to say the very least. All right, folks. Real quick, I mentioned before, this channel is totally demonetized by YouTube. We're trying to get it restored. We'll have to see what happens. But in the meantime, we do have a sponsor, and again, it's American Hartford Gold. Real big thanks to them. Tonight's sponsor, again, is American Hartford Gold. And with all the turbulence in the economy right now, the stock market, huge government spending, multi-trillion-dollar packages, competition with China, you name it, really the markets and currency are pretty volatile. It's unclear what's going to happen when it comes to inflation, when it comes to the stability of the stock markets, when it comes to the virus, businesses trying to reopen, so on. So there's a lot of unpredictability right now. But there's one thing that typically stays stable, and usually is actually on the incline, which is gold. And American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country, with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, please check out the link in the comments below, where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. So even if you're not looking to buy gold or silver, they have this 25-page information guide. They can give you some background, some advice, some information that may be useful just in general. Now, if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver on all qualifying first orders. The number for that is 877-260-2764. We have it on the screen as well. Or you can also text Joshua to 65532. And big thanks again to American Hartford Gold. Now, back to Trump and what's happening with the RNC. And again, right, the bizarre issue that Trump is basically separating himself from them, telling him not to use his likeness, not to use his name. RNC is pushing back against him rather than trying to work with him, pushing back against him, which is really not a very smart move in my analysis. And get this is what else they're doing right now. This is Epoch Times. RNC moving part of spring donor retreat to Mar-a-Lago. And what do you think the significance of that is? Why do you think they're doing that, right? Let me go into this just a little bit, and we'll jump into some more stories. It says the Republican National Committee, again the RNC, has moved a portion of its spring donor retreat program to former President Donald Trump's exclusive Mar-a-Lago resort, the club, according to a Republican attending the events and a letter from the committee's chief counsel. Now, why do you think they're holding it at Mar-a-Lago? Probably because they want the association with Trump. They need the association with Trump. And real brief on this too. Remember what happened after the inauguration, after Biden became president, inaugurated, after Trump went quiet when they were trying to impeach him, and during that whole time period, what happened when Trump started reemerging, right? Mitch McConnell basically told Trump, get behind the Republican Party. You know, we need your support, so on. He tried to get Trump to get behind the Republican Party. Trump basically came out and said, no, you get behind me. I am now the Republican Party. And so this is the conflict you're having right now. The reality is most Republican voters are not technically Republicans. A lot of them are conservatives. And a lot of them actually don't like what the Republicans used to be, which is what it seems to be some individuals are now trying to restore. Remember that when Trump was running for president back in 2016, I don't think they counted on him winning, actually. In fact, if you go to the early emails, it looked like Hillary Clinton was trying to push the Trump campaign because they saw him as disruptive and something would kind of throw a wrench into the entire Republican system, right? That was the story. When Trump actually got selected as the nominee, remember, they were even questioning whether they'd let him do it, whether they'd back him. They almost, if you remember, they almost made Trump, they almost pushed him out, and Trump was threatening to run as a third-party candidate. Remember that? And it seems now that they're done with Trump. They got him out. The institutional folks, the ones part of the institution, right? They wanted to, it seemed, really bring things back, right? Really bring things back to the way they were before Trump. But that is not going to happen now because Trump is pointing out, look, I am the Republican Party now, and you get behind me. It's not the other way around. And here we are, right? So let's move on to another story here. Then we'll go into some questions. Now, this is another chapter in what we've been watching for a while now, and something I've been pointing out quite a bit on this show. And something I'm going to be covering also as it goes forward, because really I think this conflict between states, state rights, and federal government overreach is going to become one of the biggest topics in the country right now. And already we're seeing a lot of developments on this, and now we have another one. This is Epoch Times reporting. It says Biden sued by 12 states over climate executive order. Now, let me go over this. It says President Joe Biden was sued by 12 states over a climate change-related executive order, saying it has the potential to severely affect states' economies. State attorneys from Arkansas, Arizona, I can say it, Arizona, Indiana, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Utah joined a lawsuit filed by Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt. And Eric Schmidt said this in a statement. Manufacturing, agriculture, and energy production are necessary to Missouri's economy and employ thousands of hardworking Missourians across the state. Under President Biden's executive order, which he didn't have the authority to enact, these hardworking Missourians who have lived and worked this land for generations could be left in the dust. Now, this lawsuit challenges Biden's executive order 13990, titled Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis, and accuses the Biden administration of not having sufficient authority to issue binding numbers on the, quote, social costs of greenhouse gases in federal regulations. Now, aside from the whole debate around global warming and what is settled science versus, say, institutional science that you're not allowed to question even with science, right? Aside from that whole debate, right, what we're looking at now is, again, something that's going to define, as I was saying, the conflict in America really over the next 4 years, possibly, maybe 2. We'll have to see. Which is, again, this big issue that the federal government right now is doing a lot of things that overreach its authority, overstep its authority, and states are going to have to position themselves on this. They can either fold and let the federal government overstep with these things, or they can challenge them, and we're seeing a lot of states now stepping forward to do so. Now, as they continue challenging them, which we're seeing, Texas being one of the biggest states doing this, Florida being another, Arizona being another, but many also joining in. As they continue challenging this, other states with every single law they challenge are going to start joining together and getting behind that movement. And here is an interesting one because it's 12 states on this one joining together on this, which means now you're starting to have these states join and not file individual lawsuits. You now have a kind of unionization of these states against the federal government's overreach. And this is really a new development within this that is actually pretty significant. A few of you are mentioning Civil War stuff. And yeah, from a certain perspective, this is kind of concerning because this does look like what happened during the Civil War or ahead of the Civil War, where, of course, those of you, the southern states in the U.S. basically formed a confederacy against the federal government. And they declared themselves essentially trying to declare themselves essentially a separate country. Now, of course, slavery was the big argument for that Southern states had slaves. For a lot of people in the South, though, they would argue that slavery, yes, was the linchpin of it, but the argument and the concern was state rights versus federal rights. Where does the federal government's ability end to dictate what individual states choose to do? And if you go back to the Constitution, of course, the way that the American system was set up, states actually have quite a bit of leeway in terms of what they choose to do. And the federal government right now is really overstepping a lot of these boundaries. Concerning in some regards, I don't think it's going to get to the point of civil war personally. I hope it doesn't, to be honest. But it is interesting because you're going to see a lot of states, again, really pushing back against the federal government. And again, you see them now not just doing it individually, state by state, but joining together on a lawsuit. This one being I'd say a big landmark within all of this. This is a landmark within this movement. And keep in mind, too, this is happening fast. We're only, a couple months now into Biden's administration. This is the rate at which this is happening is extremely quick. We're seeing these developments happen extremely quick. Now, I can tell you as an investigative reporter, there's a few ways I look at things. One is I look at patterns. And, you can look at the way things are developing. And when there's an anomaly within a pattern, usually that's where a story might be. Maybe something happened, right? When there's an anomaly, you want to find out what happened to change the pattern of the way things normally work. If you're talking about an organization, when something stops functioning a certain way like it's meant to, you could assume something happened, and usually that's where you look to find out what happened, right? This is how you usually launch investigations. You also look at trajectory of developments. And so, for example, we're looking at a pattern here. States stepping in, pushing back against federal government, starting to look at the legislation of different states and lawsuits of different states, learning from each other, joining together. What is the next step, right? Look at the trajectory of this development. The way this is moving is actually very interesting. And it's again, moving very quickly. It's developing very quickly. So going forward, again, I'll, of course, be keeping you all updated on this. Now, let's jump into a few questions, and then I want to talk about what's happening with Ashley Babbitt's family, considering a lawsuit around the Capitol shooting of Ashley Babbitt, which could be very, very interesting in terms of the information that comes out during the trial process, including, for example, who was in charge of security at the Capitol building on January 6th? Maybe Pelosi, one of the individuals who would have been in charge of that. And what does it mean when information is brought forward on what actually took place during the Capitol 6 siege of the Capitol building, when, again, forces and security forces that were supposed to be there were not placed there, right? This lawsuit could have huge implications. I'll be getting into that just a bit, but let me go over some questions first. This is from Leo Corey. You said, Josh, please tell us what is going on with the Supreme Court. Have they been corrupted? Well, it's hard to say, to be honest. I want to get into it. We'll see. Those of you who haven't seen the stories yet, maybe you haven't because I don't think a lot of media, maybe they're covering this one. The Supreme Court just tossed out the Trump lawsuit on election fraud. They just recently also tossed out Lynn Wood's lawsuit on election fraud. And just recently, again, they also tossed out Sidney Powell's lawsuit on election fraud. And they're doing this without giving a reason why, which means that they're not doing this because the evidence isn't there. In fact, even in our reporting, you can read Epoch Times, we have the stories on these, we provide the evidence. The evidence is there for a lot of these things, and the evidence is really undeniable on some of these things. At the very least, you have circumstantial evidence and sworn testimony that would be more than enough to have a serious case. The Supreme Court is dismissing these cases without even looking at the evidence. They're not even giving it a chance to be heard. Which, think about it. Think about this. If you were really a public official and you feel that Trump is an insurrectionist and he's spreading conspiracy theories about election fraud and incited people to raid the Capitol building into fear for your life, and you wanted to, to the point where you wanted to build a huge fence around the Capitol building to protect you and call in the National Guard to work as your personal bodyguard because you're afraid for your life. Would it not be in your interest to allow the evidence to come forward to prove for a fact that what they're saying, what these people are saying is not true, and to settle down these people, right? Would that not be your normal course of interest if you were actually concerned about these things? The question is, if they're actually concerned about this to the extent that they would call in the National Guard, surround the Capitol building with a huge fence, and the White House with a huge fence, and deal with all the controversy around that and risk, they say, of even domestic terrorism, why not just let the Supreme Court hear the case? If they say it doesn't hold up, let the evidence come out and prove it's not holding up. Why not let that process go through? Why reject it and allow this inflamed culture that they're warning about continue? Maybe it's because they don't want something to be heard. Maybe it's because they don't want discussions on this to be brought forward. Maybe it's because they fear that information that comes out may actually have an impact on the state of the government right now, and they don't want to have to deal with the controversy around that. From any normal perspective, though, if they truly believe the narratives they're pushing, it would be in their interest, right? If they really believe they're innocent, it would really be in their interest to let the Supreme Court hear these cases. And so the serious question we should all be asking is, why are they not letting that happen? So on your question, have they been corrupted? Speculation, I'd say possibly, in my opinion. This is from Robert Robillard. You said, "Hey Josh, as a Canadian, if I sneak over the border into the States, am I entitled to the same benefits and privileges as those coming across your southern border?" I've wondered that myself, actually. How do you define privilege of illegal immigrants, you have to call them now? How do you define privilege for illegal immigrants? Is it only from people coming from Latin America? Does it apply to people traveling from, say, Africa or East Asia? Does it apply to Canadians who decide to cross the border and decide they want free healthcare using, of course they have free healthcare, but there's a long wait line. It's harder to get. Could they come here, for example, cross the border, rent a hotel, and apply for a government stimulus because they're putting out these stimulus checks? I don't know. Maybe you could. And to what extent could I just claim, even as a citizen, that I no longer identify as, being an American citizen? Could I then get the benefits like free healthcare and so on that is being offered to them in states like New York? Could I then just, say identify as being again an illegal alien? I want these benefits. Would they have to give them to me? How do they prove that you're illegal, right? How do they approve that you're illegal to deem that you should be able to receive these funds or able to get away with certain things that they were able to get away with? It's a big question. Another big question is, folks like myself, when I travel, and I travel quite a lot for work, it's a bit different because journalists are considered essential workers, so it's a little easier. But the process is quite annoying. You're supposed to quarantine in some states. They have all these rules in place. Now, why is it that most Americans have to quarantine? Most Americans have to deal with all this stuff, but the border is basically opened up. People are being encouraged to come here in droves right now. They're saying that in the last, I think, 2 to 4 months, they've had more people come across the border illegally than they had over the past 2 years combined. And to the extent that the Department of Homeland Security is actually calling for volunteers to help deal with it. Now, why is it that you can have international travel, which if you're flying on an airplane right now, you have to note that is one of the serious concerns? Why is it that if you're flying, you have to deal with international travel regulations around the virus and quarantine, but people are being not only allowed to, but even encouraged through financial incentives to travel internationally illegally, while states are being told they cannot enforce the laws on that by the federal government, which is pushing this whole narrative on the virus and on the lockdowns? Why is that allowed? Right? Maybe it's because, again, the federal government has some other agenda with this. Maybe, again, it's because they have something else in mind that they deem more important, right? That they deem more important than all this lockdown narrative, all this mask narrative, all this quarantine narrative. This means that what they're doing, to them in their own analysis, the importance of this open borders policy is more important to them than the idea of quarantine, than the threat of the virus, and so on. And so what would the agenda be that they would deem to be more important than that? Not to mention the fact that if they actually did care about these individuals and they really feared for their safety, why would they be putting them into holding cells, encouraging them to come here in large numbers, putting them in holding cells, right? Kids in cages type situations, as they were accusing Trump of doing, which they have now as well under Biden. Why is it they're encouraging that to the extent that these entire facilities are full and they need to build new ones because they're so full, putting people in close proximity to each other and making, again, a pandemic, if they actually believe this is a threat, even worse, right? Maybe it's because there's something more to it. At the very least, you should question what makes them deem the value of this more important than the value of the narrative they're pushing, again, around the lockdowns, again, around the virus, again, around the pandemic. What makes this more important to them, that they would violate the very principles they're trying to push? Important question to ask, right? All right, this next question is from Monica Morris. He said, Josh, can the bills and legislation in the states that are to protect our rights from the DC radicals really protect us from these leftist orders? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I think you're going to have a lot of states pushing back very hard against it. You're going to have some states, as is already happening in some states, using the sanctuary city laws like they did under Trump, for example, where New York, California, for example, declared sanctuary city laws to say that Trump could not enforce immigration law in their states or their cities. You're going to have states playing the same game. And it's going to be a complicated battle, actually, because if the Supreme Court is not really functioning in an honest way, which I hope they will, but we'll have to see, given the way things are going. If the Supreme Court is functioning in an honest way, then they should challenge it based on constitutional grounds. And if they rule on the Constitution, a lot of what the federal government is doing right now would be considered unconstitutional, meaning states would win over it. At the same time, though, if that does not happen, local states can pass their own laws to challenge federal law or to override federal law, as we saw, for example, with decriminalization of marijuana, decriminalization of other things, or, for example, orders in some states, like they did with the sanctuary city laws, that will even punish police if they, for example, violate the state laws to support the federal laws. You're going to have a lot of this happening. At the same time, though, the American system is set up in a very interesting way. Yes, we do have very far left, not even normal socialist, but pretty extreme socialist policies getting pushed forward in the US right now. Not only do you have that happen, right, but you have a lot of individuals advocating for it. The media, mainstream media, is pretty deeply in line with that. You have a lot of foreign interest. There's a lot going on right now, right? But America is really set up differently than most other countries. And it's because of this that this system they're using to try to accomplish these goals is going to have a lot more roadblocks in the United States than it did in other countries that did have socialist movements, socialist revolutions. Because again, basically America is like 50 different little countries, right? The United States, 50 different states, each of which has its own government, each of which has its own laws, each of which has its own military, the National Guard, and each of which is able to challenge federal law to some extent using local law and so on. And then, of course, America is different because we have these states, and then you have the federal government, which is like a government on top of these governments. If you go back in history, this would be almost like a dynasty type system, just with an electoral system built into it, where again you'd have like 50 different kings, and then the emperor is the king of the kings essentially within that system. It's kind of like that, but not quite. Yeah, federalism, right? Not quite, again, because we have an election system built into it. But because of that system, it's difficult. It's difficult for them to change it. It's more difficult. They have a lot more roadblocks they have to get through, a lot more red tape they have to get through. All right, I'll do one more question, then I'll go into some more stories for the night. Is from Beth De Niro Snell. Good seeing you on here. You said, is the Supreme Court going to look at that lawsuit and not dismiss it like how it has been? Yeah, unfortunately, as I mentioned, news today, the Supreme Court has just rejected the last of these lawsuits. And so The lawsuits around the election at the Supreme Court level seem to be a lost cause at this point, and they're rejecting these without saying why. Um, so that's where things are at, unfortunately. Local states, though, are still pushing back against it. Arizona is moving forward with its audit, not the Maricopa County audit, but the state audit. And you have a lot of movement taking place elsewhere, Georgia, other states as well. There's still a lot going on within states. Now, let's go on to the next story for the night. I mentioned Ashley Babbitt and what's happening with her family. Now, it says here, this is Epoch Times reporting. Ashley Babbitt family considers lawsuit in Capitol shooting death. And it says the family of the woman shot dead inside the U.S. Capitol on January 6 is considering filing a lawsuit against the officer who shot her. The lawsuit would allege constitutional violations. Terrell Roberts, a lawyer for Ashley Babbitt's family, told the Epoch Times, including excessive use of force. And he said, pending the outcome of the investigation into the shooting, quote, that will be filed against the officer, the Capitol Police. Now, Babbitt, an Air Force veteran, was shot as she attempted to climb through a broken window into the Speaker's lobby, which is adjacent to the House chamber in the Capitol. It was the only shooting during the breach. Again, those of you who saw the video, Ashley Babbitt was shot in the neck, fell backwards, and later died. Now, those of you who watched the full video, as I mentioned on the show, you can watch the interview I did with the Japanese journalist, Masako Ganaha. Great reporter. That she mentioned as we go over the video and we show some clips of it, you actually had many police present right next to Ashley Babbitt, which does bring into question why the Capitol officer deemed it necessary to shoot and kill her. Now, standing right in front of the windows, right before she climbed through them, were 2 to 3 normal Capitol police officers who were standing there, looked kind of annoyed and bothered, but not afraid. You had people yelling at them, so on. One individual who was behaving very suspiciously, as we mentioned in our video analyzing this, talks to his friend who is draped with one of these "Don't Tread on Me" flags. Talks with his friend and then goes up and speaks with these officers. He speaks with these officers. The officers decide to move. Whatever he said to them made them move. Then what does he do? He goes to his friend again and takes a black helmet and he starts smashing the window. Now, at this time, you have 2 to 3 riot police right behind them, in addition to the police who are right there by the door. Riot police walking up the stairs with rifles, right? Rifles. They did not need to use violent force. Walking casually up the stairs with these rifles. Yeah, we're showing a clip here of that interview. They're walking up these stairs, and then as they're doing that, right? Ashley Babbitt gets up, tries to climb through the window. You see a hand with a gun point out from behind the corner and shoots her. She falls backwards. The officers who are standing right next to her this entire time, try to administer first aid. This is what happens. You can see this video here. We're showing it. Look at these officers. Look, yeah, three officers, right? You see that 3 officers right in front of the window. These officers were right there this entire time. Why was violence necessary? Why was shooting her necessary? Right? This should be a serious question. And then in addition to this, there's some very strange behaviors of the other people who are involved with this. The individual taking that black helmet, after all this happens, goes down the stairs right behind where those officers just walked up, the ones with the rifles. And he opens his backpack and he changes his clothes, suggesting that maybe there was some pre-planning for this. Maybe something happened. Regardless, the entire scene is very bizarre, and again, because of the presence of at least 5 to 6 officers, including 3 with rifles, really pretty well numbered against the people who are there. Why was that necessary? Why was the shooting of Ashley Babbitt necessary? Yeah, you see here, these are the officers on the stairwell right behind her. Right behind her were these officers. They could have pulled her back. They could have stopped her. They could have stopped other people from moving in. Why did the officer inside decide to shoot rather than just arrest an unarmed woman climbing through a window? The issue with this is very, very strange. Now, this brings up some other issues, though, with this. Because who was in charge of the Capitol? Who was in charge of security at the Capitol building? Who is normally in charge of security? Is it the Speaker of the House? And who is that, right? That'd be Nancy Pelosi, possibly some other folks as well. Ironically, some of the same individuals calling now for the investigation through the new commission they're trying to start up. Basically, the individuals who themselves should be investigated for their decisions as well, made on that day to not have additional security, turning down Trump's offer to have the National Guard position there, and even why there wasn't some of the security that was you would normally even have during a protest of that size at the building. Now, what does this mean as this goes forward? It means that the individual who was in charge of security may be part of the investigative process, maybe part of the investigations. And if the family chooses to file this lawsuit, well, that just may be a topic that's brought up within it, because the lawsuit would require, to some extent, an investigation and an audit, possibly, of violations to security that took place. What happened, for example, with the officer who made that call? What kind of conversations were happening behind the scenes? The type of security that was on site at the time? Why, for example, officers opened up the gates and let people walk through and waved them in? Why did all this happen, right? You're going to be dealing with all these issues. Yeah, so Battle Elf is noting qualified immunity. So officers do have qualified immunity with some of the stuff, but there could be some other levels to this. We'll have to see how this works out. At the very least, though, by filing this lawsuit, they could raise some of this discussion. And at the very least, if they try to file this lawsuit, it may lead to some of this information having to be investigated and possibly revealed to the public. And at the very least, if they choose not to do that, keep in mind the individuals who are in charge of security and who are going to be targets of this side of the investigation are themselves trying to run the commission right now that you have that's claiming to investigate this from the congressional side, this congressional committee. And so you're going to have some holes blown in this narrative at the very least, I would say. And honestly, the narrative is already kind of falling apart. All right, now another story here, kind of a bit of a shift, but something important to note. This is Epoch Times reporting again. It says, and this is tying to China and what it's doing right now. It says, China increases defense budget. Premier orders military to prepare for war. And I'll explain what this means a bit. Just give me a sec. That says here, China will increase its military budget to 1.35 trillion yuan, about $207.8 billion in 2021, which is 6.8% higher than 2020. Chinese state media reported on March 6th. Now, just a real quick note on that. When the Chinese people talk about, oh, well, America's military budget is so much higher, China doesn't have to deal with companies like Lockheed Martin and so on. In fact, they just steal their research through industrial theft and so on. They don't have to pay big, R&D budgets and so on. They just steal it. They also don't really have private industry outside the control of the Chinese Communist Party building military equipment, which means they can steal stuff for innovation, manufacture it through domestic companies. Their overhead for cost is extremely lower than what the U.S. is paying, meaning that their military budget goes a whole lot further than ours. And so even though the number is much smaller, the degree to which it can go is actually much, much, much larger by many degrees. At the same time, with this as well, you also have the issue that China also has kind of a, as many people suspect the U.S. does as well, China also has a black budget for its military. And so the issue of military spending in China can't be looked at just on surface numbers. But let's go to this a bit more. It says, one expert told the Epoch Times that the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP's top priority, is to strengthen its military. During the ruling party's most important annual meeting, known as the Two Sessions on March 5th, Premier Li Keqiang said, we should comprehensively strengthen the military exercises and fully prepare for war. And U.S.-based China Affairs commentator Tong Jiangyuan told the Epoch Times on March 7th, quote, building a strong military is one of Chinese leader Xi Jinping's top tasks. His slogan is building a strong China. And he continues, I think Xi will take aggressive action after he can take another tenure, which would be about 2022. Now, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, they're they have the peaceful rise of China doctrine. This was a Deng Xiaoping policy. Deng Xiaoping was the leader of the CCP before Jiang Zemin, who was the leader before Xi Jinping. So 2 leaders ago. Hu Jintao did the reforms in opening up, where he brought in some systems of capitalism into China, state capitalism, meaning the CCP still controls it, meaning socialism, and used that again to give the image in the international community that China was becoming more democratic, was changing, so on, brought into the World Trade Organization, given all kinds of trade benefits, violated these, took advantage of these, and used that as a tool to basically dominate the world economy and take advantage of it and bribe a whole lot of officials and so on, right? Long story short, that's what happened. Now, he had this peaceful rise of China doctrine. The peaceful rise only happens until they can militarily dominate. Once they can militarily compete and dominate, that whole peaceful rise goes out the window. What does that mean? The Chinese Communist Party believes it's already well on the trajectory to have the most powerful military in the world. They're already working very hard towards that. And while the US right now still maintains that seat, and maybe will for the next 5 to 10 years at this rate, the Chinese Communist Party is moving quickly. And as soon as that 5 to 10 years is up, maybe even less, well, what's going to happen if the military in the US is gutted? If they, for example, focus more on race issues and race politics than they do on military training and military preparedness, if they, for example, take the US military and instead of focusing on combat training and so on, they refocus it to focus on things like infrastructure building or environmental policy, which has been discussed and it was even part of Biden's early policies, well, that's what's going to happen. Once the US can no longer properly defend against the Chinese military, the Chinese Communist Party's whole system of this peaceful rise is going to end. And they're already talking about this very, very openly. This is not like some conspiracy or some kind of secret, right? This isn't a secret. The Chinese Communist Party's leaders talk about this totally openly. Like they're so totally blunt and honest and open with it that it's almost ridiculous that they're not called out for it. They are completely open and honest with their agenda. They talk about it. They have policies named after it. They have entire warfare doctrines defined and written on it, which folks like myself talk about, but which a lot of people don't talk about. They're not hiding it almost at all. Their goal is to overtake the United States and to become the world leader, both economically, militarily, and in terms of the China model, becoming the world system of government, right? As opposed to the American model. And they talk about there's the Pax Americana, the peace under America. They talk about the Pax Sinica. As soon as the Chinese Communist Party feels it's of sufficient power, this is the dominating force that the future holds for us if nothing's done about it. Now, on a brighter note, even if the US does roll some of these things back, which it's currently seeming to be doing, you do have a lot of other countries starting to step up to the plate, including Germany, doing some freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, Japan, India especially, even Australia, other countries as well. And so it's not just the US at this point, but this is the trajectory we're heading on if nothing's done about it. Real quick, Amanda Kassler, you said, Josh, have you been working on your communism documentary? I have. In fact, yesterday I was filming most of the day in the office, and I think we'll see. I don't want to overpromise, but I think you folks will enjoy what we're putting together. And those of you weren't, I've been talking about it for a long time that I want to make this special series about the history of communism. We're finally moving on it. We're already in the recording stage of that. We're looking at maybe 6 or 7 part series, and then maybe just continue doing series like this. That is the hope. We'll have to see how the first one goes. But yes, we are currently in the process of recording, and so I'll keep you all updated on that. Now, another story here, one you all might find very interesting as well. This is from Natalie Winters. She's a reporter with the National Pulse, really great investigative journalist. I mean, she's been doing some really, really hard-hitting stories on the Chinese Communist Party and on the United Front. And I've been working as an investigative reporter since 2008, and my beat has been the United Front and its related organizations, it's like a niche of the niche topics, right? It's a very difficult topic to get into. But she's one of the only other journalists I know of who's working on this stuff, and she's doing some fantastic work. But get this. They wrote an exclusive. Bill Gates advised Chinese Communist Party influence group, quote, conducting propaganda campaigns. And it says here, Bill Gates has advised and addressed various groups within the Chinese Communist Party's United Front, the country's top propaganda effort that the U.S. government identifies as seeking to influence the West to, quote, take actions or adopt positions supportive of Beijing's preferred policies. Gates has served on a steering committee for the China United States Exchange Foundation, or CUSEF, founded by the chairman of the highest-ranking entity overseeing within China's United Front work. In other words, an organization founded by the chairman of the highest-ranking entity overseeing within the United Front, according to the U.S.-China Security and Economic Review Commission. It says, the effort, according to the Congressional Government Report, aims to, quote, co-opt and neutralize sources of potential opposition to the policies and authority of its ruling Chinese Communist Party, and influence Western elites to, quote, take actions, right, get this, influence Western elites to take actions or adopt positions supportive of Beijing's preferred policies. Now, in practice, the group is set out to, quote, effectively disseminate positive messages to the media, key influencers, and opinion leaders, and the general public regarding the Chinese Communist Party, according to FARA, or Foreign Agents Registration Act filings with the Department of Justice. It continues, Gates served on a CUSEF steering committee, quote, providing valuable advice and comment on a 2013 report entitled U.S.-China Economic Relations in the Next 10 Years Towards Deeper Engagement and Mutual Benefit. And it continues stating this a bit further down. It says, but Gates' relationship with the Chinese Communist Party's United Front runs even deeper and darker. Gates, alongside former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, spoke and, quote, extended his congratulations at a forum hosted by the China Association for International Friendly Contact, or CAIFC, in 2012. And the CAIFC, however, has been discredited by the U.S. government as a, quote, front organization for the former General Political Department. Real brief. For the Chinese Communist Party, it has two main branches that work on political warfare. There's the United Front, which is an overt spy department. The United Front is basically the Chinese Communist Party's system for subverting the West. Typically, it will work through, it's a Chinese government branch. It will work through the consulates. The consulates, through that, basically function as overseas Chinese government offices, including on U.S. soil in all the major cities. From there, they work with the fraternal organizations, the Chinese hometown associations, which work as the unofficial governing bodies of Chinatowns. One of the reasons why Chinatowns are so hard to penetrate. Beneath the tongs are the triads, the Chinese mafia, and above the tongs are all kinds of government outreach programs, government relations programs, individuals tied to them in just about every official agency, every government agency, every position in the police, military, businesses, you name it. They have oil worker tongs, they have student tongs, they have science research tongs, they have everything. If they want to tap, once they gain control of the tongs, they can tap these networks to influence any part of our system. This is how the United Front works. And their focus as well is inviting U.S. government officials. Now, there's two sides to it. There's the United Front, which works on this. Then you have the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, which works hand in hand with the United Front. And oftentimes the OCAO, Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, will approach U.S. government officials from your highest level to your lowest level, right? From like the president of the United States down to your local city council member. They will invite everyone on trips back to China. And during those charm trips, they'll try to compromise them in different ways, whether it's business deals for them and their families, whether it's just, whispering into their ears the policies of the CCP, whether it's building sister city programs, whether it's bringing along their friends or family members and giving their friends and family members financial deals, and so on, business deals, or whether it's things like honey traps, sex traps, which get them basically compromised through blackmail. They do these things aggressively. I would argue that you would have a difficult time finding any official in the United States who has not been that they have not attempted to compromise through this network at some point. And it's not just politicians, it's also journalists, it's think tank people working at think tanks. And look at the money think tanks get from the CCP. It's academics, and look at the number of academics who were investigated under the Trump administration for being tied to networks alongside this. It's anybody of influence. And the idea is basically to gain control over the elite of a society. And by gaining control of the elite, use them to basically steer the future of the direction of that society in the way the CCP wants. That is the goal of the United Front, and that's how it works hand in hand with the OCAO. The other part of this is the General Political Department, which is actually even more nefarious. This is the one, again, is Natalie notes in her article, Natalie Winters notes in this article. The CAIFC, however, has been described by the U.S. government as a front organization for the former General Political Department. The General Political Department was even more nefarious. This is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military. This is a military branch working on political warfare. Those of you interested, there was a report from it was Project 2049 Institute. It was an entire big report, fantastic report about Chinese influence operations working through political warfare systems, specifically about the General Political Department. And while we had this whole narratives about, active measures and Russia disinformation and Russia trying to influence our elections, the Chinese Communist Party has an entire military branch dedicated to that. And that was the General Political Department. Now they've merged and changed these branches around now. They're different now, but they still have these operations. And at the same time, the other side of that is the United Front. Huge organization, tons of members, very large systems to penetrate and control Western societies. And here we have very great research from National Pulse on this, demonstrating that many people, she's doing a lot of research on this, but demonstrating that many people, including Gates, has had ties to both of these organizations. Something I'd say that is extremely concerning, given that Gates right now is working on different policies with U.S. government officials around virus reopenings, how to handle the virus, how to deal with the pandemic. At the same time, when the Chinese Communist Party is promoting the China model, lockdowns, mask mandates, and even the system to bounce back from the virus, they're basing the entire foundation of how to bounce back from it on the China model. Now, if the CCP is pushing that and you have an individual tied to these systems in some regards, or at least associated with them, running the programs in the U.S. to advise these things, what is the risk? Does this demonstrate independence from the system being pushed by the CCP when we can observe as well, based on just circumstantial viewing of what the CCP is doing and what it's pushing and what has been done here, that we're adopting some of the same methods? What does that say about it, right? I'd say it's very concerning. Not to mention, as we mentioned in the previous episode, again, another story showing that the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, was also working with this Chinese company that was working on DNA mining through the COVID tests. Through the tests you're taking with these viruses, the companies are mining DNA, which can be used for all sorts of nefarious things, especially if the Chinese Communist Party and especially if its military are tied to it. So very, very concerning developments. And fantastic research as well. I highly recommend reading that story. All right, folks, let me go over a couple of questions, and we'll call it a night. This is from DSWP. He said, do you know why CCP is being protected by the DNC and many Republicans? Organ transplants, of course. Please think. Well, I'd say there's a lot. Well, you can speculate. I would say part of it has to do with the United Front and the General Political Department, because they work. This is an entire government branch that is huge, working through organizations that have tens of thousands, even arguably they claim hundreds of thousands of members. Hundreds of thousands of members within these organizations, which can be tapped by the Chinese Communist Party through these influence networks to impact our system, and are working full-time as full-time jobs, some of them, to compromise U.S. government officials. Now, how many officials do you think have given into that, the bribes, the sex traps, the honey pots, the influence operations? How many of them do you think have been influenced in some way when you have not only an entire government branch, an entire network of organizations, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of members with some of them, and an entire military branch focused on this as a full-time job, right? How many officials do you think have been compromised? And it's not just officials. Even if the officials themselves haven't been compromised, think about where government officials get their information from, right? Think tanks, academics, advisory when they call people in to testify, and journalists. And if the Chinese Communist Party, through the exact same networks, are trying to compromise think tanks, academics, like academic espionage and Confucius institutes and Chinese student and scholar associations financed and directed by the Chinese consulates, and journalists, which we've noted previously, actually, again, great research by Natalie Winters, the National Pulse, taking paid dinners with organizations tied to these same with organizations tied to the United Front, as has been demonstrated and is public. How many of them have written articles in support of these exact same systems that are informing our government, even if they haven't been compromised? This is the problem we have with this. And so, yes, I would say that if they haven't been compromised, they at the very least have been influenced by these operations. And the scale of these operations is massive. So you could say some of them are on the more innocent end. Maybe they've heard information from this. Maybe they're improperly informed. On a more mid-level end, maybe they have friends who are Chinese spies and they may not know it, agents of influence. And on the more extreme end, maybe they're complicit. Like these big businesses working with these Chinese companies using slave labor in Xinjiang, and while at the same time pushing, race narratives in the U.S. about the history of slavery. Organizations working with the Chinese Communist Party when it's known to be committing genocide, designated as committing genocide against its own people, while at the same time talking about, bad police in the U.S. and, bend the knee and don't say the national anthem. These two-faced organizations speaking with forked tongues about the narratives in the U.S., pushing things while totally violating every single principle they claim to represent while dealing with the CCP. Maybe it's because they just need a bit of money, right? Maybe it's about business. Maybe it's because they've been completely compromised. And so this is, I'd say, the spectrum of issues you're dealing with when it comes to this. All right, folks, I'm going to call it a night here because it's getting quite late. Now, I'm going to be traveling again. I'm actually going to be speaking at an event in Charleston, and so I'll be on the road. I should be able to do the live this coming Thursday. We should have everything on schedule. If not, we will let you know. But again, normally Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, tune in for the live Q&As. I'll be doing these 3 times a week. It should be here this Thursday. If we're not, we'll let you know in the community page. Should be here, so check it out. We'll let you know if otherwise. And also, folks, please check out the interviews we've been publishing. I think you'll really like them. The one we did today, for example, was with one of the guys leading the push to remove Governor Gavin Newsom in California from office. I think you'll find it very interesting. Really working on a lot, folks. Again, still working on the special feature series about the history of communism and some of the different stages of its subversion of the West, which we've already started filming. And so a lot in the works right now. Stay tuned. And again, see you on Thursday. If anything happens, we'll let you know, but be here 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. All right, folks. Always appreciate it. Let's see. James Woolsey, thanks as well. Janet, Jumpkin Janet, yeah, thank you. Misty Jenkins, thank you. Maria Anderson, yeah, really appreciate all of you. You folks are great. As always, if you want to support us as well, we do have a Patreon. You can check out our links in the description below. We are still demonetized by YouTube. We also have Donor Box, which actually is better than Patreon. And so, folks, if you want to donate to the show, help us out, you can find the links in the description below. And also, it still does help us if you like and subscribe, tell a friend about the show. I always appreciate the support. Now, that said, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. Americans gradually losing faith in the different institutions this country is built upon, including now the electoral system, and including now as well the systems of justice. Now, America, on both sides, people are concerned about the integrity of our country, the integrity of the systems this country is built upon. And going forward, this country needs more than ever to find a way to reconcile with this corruption as they observe it, whether you're Democrat or Republican, observing politicians they believe do not represent them, observing justice systems they believe have not acted in accordance with the grievances they brought to them. The country right now is in a state of disarray and a state of hopelessness. And moving forward, I think more than ever, people need a ray of hope. People need to realize and understand once again, and see proof of it, that the system represents their interests, that the representatives we have in these offices represent the American people and not personal interest, that the systems of elections represent the will of the people and not the will of a handful of individuals who may not be willing to hear information or be willing to look at information. The United States is in a very desperate state right now. And for the world as well, this goes even deeper, because America was the beacon of hope. America was the model of a free society. America was the system on which the image of a free and open society was built. And many countries look to the United States as a model for their own countries, their own model for what a free and self-governing people look like. That model is now being damaged. That image is now being damaged. And countries are now wondering what model to look at. As we go forward, the Chinese Communist Party very likely will use this. The Chinese Communist Party will very likely try to rebuild itself. And the CCP's China model, as they call it, will become a competitor to the U.S. model on the global stage. This is where the United States and the world are now at.